Homage to Buddha Shakyamuni, homage to Manjushri, homage to all the lineage masters. Profound and subtle dharma is rarely encountered in eons. Now we can follow it. May we realize the Tathagata's meaning. To liberate all sentient beings, please generate unsurpassed bodhicitta. Now let's continue with our study of an overview of the Guhyagarbha Tantra, Essence of Clear Light. Previously, we discussed the path of accumulation, which is one of the 37 factors of enlightenment. Specifically, we looked at the first stage, the minor path of accumulation, which focuses on the 4 close placements of mindfulness. For the Shravakas, the practice of the 4 close placements of mindfulness primarily focuses on the 4 noble truths as the object of observation. In the Mahayana schools of mind only and the middle way, the 4 close placements are viewed as emptiness from the ultimate perspective, while from the relative perspective, they are treated as mere appearances that lack any inherent nature. Now, when we look at the secret mantra, whether it's the mindfulness of body, feelings, mind, or phenomena, their very essence is realized as being both primordially pure and empty. This is what we call purity and evenness, the fact that purity and equality are inseparable and non-dual. In the view of secret mantra, this is the most crucial point of all. I'm not quite sure if we'll have enough time this year to finish the section on the view. Maybe we'll cover a bit, or perhaps we'll have to wait until next year or even the year after. After all, everything in this world is impermanent. It's hard to say whether I'll be able to finish teaching the later sections. And honestly, it's also hard to say if all of you will be able to finish listening to them. Everyone's individual causes and conditions are different. But regardless, I hope everyone here can make a sincere aspiration. Personally, as long as I don't run into any major obstacles, I really want to finish teaching the Guhyagarbha Tantra for you. That is my intention. My aspiration is to complete it within about 2 or 3 years. We've just touched on some of the differences between the Sutrayana and the Vajrayana. But remember, the most distinctive feature of the Vajrayana is the view of purity and evenness. Here, evenness refers to the aspect of emptiness, while purity is about primordial purity. The actual nature of all phenomena is, in fact, purity and evenness. Realizing that purity and equality are inseparable, this is the unique view of the Vajrayana. If you want to understand the nature of all things, it is vital to realize this view of purity and evenness. So, moving on to the text, accordingly, mantra's beginning stage of the path of accumulation is cultivated with the characteristic of the 4 close placements of mindfulness. As we discussed earlier, this marks the entry into the path of accumulation. So, is there a difference between the path of accumulation in Sutrayana versus Vajrayana? Yes, there is. In the Sutrayana traditions, you enter the path of accumulation the moment an authentic, uncontrived bodhicitta arises in your mind stream. That is, the sincere wish to liberate all sentient beings throughout the world. In that context, there's no specific time limit mentioned for reaching the goal. Generally, it's said to take 3 asankhyeya kalpas for those with sharp faculties, 7 for those with medium faculties, and 33 for those with dull faculties. However, according to Longchenpa and certain other masters, it doesn't necessarily have to take that long. These asankhyeya kalpas are simply described that way to suit the different spiritual dispositions of sentient beings. Because there are infinite types of dispositions, we can also define the stages of the path based on one's own state of mind. There are explanations like that. But anyway, even if it's not exactly 3 asankhyeya kalpas, it's still going to be a very, very long time. So in the Sutrayana, the moment that kind of bodhicitta is born in your heart, you are said to have started the minor path of accumulation. That's how it works. But in the Vajrayana, things are a bit different. First, the view is different. When it comes to the view, as we discussed regarding the 4 close placements of mindfulness, you must first gain a real understanding of this purity and evenness. Furthermore, there is a distinction in terms of the time frame. Particularly from the perspective of Anuttara Yoga, it is possible to attain Buddhahood in a single lifetime. This involves the aspiration to truly mature my own ability and the conditions required to liberate all sentient beings. So, whether it's the speed of this aspiration or the focus of one's view, there are certain differences. This is the path of accumulation in the Vajrayana. When it possesses the nature of these 4 close placements of mindfulness, it is called the minor path of accumulation of the Vajrayana. As that increases, the middle stage of the path of accumulation is generated with the characteristic of the four accurate abandonments. The idea here is that on the middle path of accumulation in the Sutrayana, one aims to give rise to virtuous qualities that have not yet arisen, and to prevent those that have already arisen from declining. At the same time, one prevents non-virtuous states from arising, and quickly abandons any that have already arisen. These are the four accurate abandonments. In the Sutrayana, this is a way of practicing both the virtues and non-virtues within the Four Noble Truths, and practice specific ways to cultivate the good and weed out the bad. But in this teaching, we are talking about the four accurate abandonments of the middle path of accumulation in the Vajrayana. Technically, this does include all general virtues, but what is the most fundamental virtue here? It is the root of virtue that realizes the view of purity and evenness. So, regarding this root of virtue, if it has already arisen, make sure you don't lose it. If it hasn't arisen yet, try to develop it as quickly as possible. That is the core intention here. As for what we call non-virtue, in this context, it refers to all those discursive thoughts and attachments that contradict the view of purity and evenness. Basically, if your fixations aren't about purity and evenness, they all count as non-virtues. You must abandon these non-virtues if they have already arisen, and prevent them from arising if they haven't yet. This is where the distinction lies. Of course, this pattern continues as we move further. As that increases, the most advanced stage of the path of accumulation is generated with the characteristic of the four legs of miraculous emanation. Normally, these four legs are the will to practice, diligence, focused attention, and investigative analysis. Again, the Vajrayana explains these differently from the Sutrayana, always in relation to the view of purity and evenness. This constitutes the advanced path of accumulation in the Vajrayana. Thus, on the path of accumulation through the emphasis of study and contemplation, the meaning of the inseparable truth of purity and evenness is comprehended merely theoretically. This is called the path of accumulation because the generation and completion stages are effort-based, and because of being the causal impetus for the paths of the Aryas to arise in the mind stream. So what exactly is the path of accumulation? Mipham Rinpoche uses very concise language here to make it exceptionally clear. So generally speaking, what's this path all about? The path of accumulation is characterized by an understanding gained through hearing and contemplation. It's not yet a direct realization. We aren't talking about full awakening or enlightened realization at this stage. It's an understanding you get from study. You use your mind to really think through purity and evenness. And this is something that every one of you here can arise right now. By hearing and contemplating, when the meaning of the inseparable truth of purity and evenness is comprehended merely theoretically, you finally realize, okay, it's true. Everything is pure and empty. You can grasp the entire meaning purely in theory. So the way we generate bodhicitta in the Vajrayana isn't just the ordinary wish to liberate beings. Think about the Guru Yoga we practice every day. Within that prayer, there's a specific verse of generating bodhicitta. It means that both I and all other beings have always been Buddhas from the very beginning. That's our true nature, and my wish is to finally realize it. This is how we set our intention. This specific method of generating bodhicitta, introduced by Mipham Rinpoche here, is the unique way of the Vajrayana. It is the realization that I and all sentient beings are Buddhas by nature. It is about returning to the truth that we are already enlightened. We are Buddhas already, but we have become temporarily confused along the way. In reality, we and all sentient beings have always been Buddhas. That's what this aspiration is all about. This is quite different from the approach in the Sutrayana. If you use a kind of faith through conviction, or let's say a theoretical understanding, to realize through study and contemplation that we and all beings are primordially Buddhas, then this is a stage of effort-based conceptual comprehension. At this point, you are diligently practicing the generation and completion stages, which serve as the causal impetus for the paths of the Aryas to arise in the mind stream. This is called the path of accumulation. The definition of the path of accumulation is very clear here. You should all understand that in the Vajrayana, the path of accumulation must be explained in this specific way. So that's the path of accumulation. But what is it exactly? Actually, if we look at the path of accumulation in the Sutrayana, it also involves using study and contemplation to theoretically realize the emptiness of all phenomena. It's a stage of practice, though it doesn't mention the generation and completion stages. In the Sutrayana, the path of accumulation similarly relies on hearing and contemplation. You are basically using your intellect to understand the emptiness of all things. This specific stage is called the path of accumulation. You could put it that way. So we finished the discussion on the path of accumulation. Actually, the 5 paths and 10 bhumis are essential for our practice in Buddhism. Some of you might not have encountered these concepts before. Whether you study the Ornament of Clear Realization, the Middle Way, or any other scripture, according to the view of Lord Maitreya, this applies to every one of us sitting here today. If you want to become a Buddha, you must go through the 5 paths and 10 bhumis. It's not that easy. You can't just say, I want to be enlightened, and then expect it to happen right away. You can't just skip the steps. That's just not how it works. That's not how it's taught in Buddhism at all. Even Longchenpa emphasized this repeatedly in his Finding Rest in the Nature of the Mind. As the results of generation and completion practice continue to increase through the emphasis of meditation experience, when a general understanding of the meaning of the indicated genuine fundamental nature occurs, this is called the path of unification. So what exactly is the path of unification? On the path of unification, you are still practicing the generation and completion stages, and your practice is progressing day by day. While the path of accumulation focused on hearing and contemplation, here, as Mipham Rinpoche notes, the emphasis shifts to actual meditation. It's not that there's no more study, but meditation becomes the primary driver. The path of accumulation was purely about theoretical understanding, but here it's about experience. You are beginning to personally feel the signified meaning. You are experiencing the true nature of primordial purity and equality, but still through general characteristics. Now, there are 2 ways to talk about general characteristics. One way is quite different from how we use the term in Buddhist logic. In Buddhist logic, a general characteristic is often just an abstract concept with no real substance. For example, if I picture the general idea of a pillar or a vase in my mind, that's just a rough mental image. However, the general characteristic we are talking about here is actually a direct experience that comes through meditation. When many great masters explain this experience, they describe it as a state of non-conceptuality, a non-dual dharmadhatu. But is it the actual dharmadhatu? Well, you haven't fully reached the ultimate dharmadhatu yet, but it is completely in tune with it. This is what we call the path luminosity. Some past masters used to say, you've experienced the path luminosity directly, but you haven't yet seen the natural luminosity. This is a common way of explaining the path of unification. So, what exactly is this path luminosity? It means you have a vivid experience of the Dharmata that is usually realized on the path of seeing. How do we experience it? For instance, true direct perception is a non-conceptual knowing, but the experience at this stage is still technically a conceptual thought. However, this thought has transformed into a vivid image of non-conceptuality. It's like if I see something blue today. At first, it's just my visual consciousness perceiving it. Then a thought arises. I recognize this as blue, but this blue is actually a fabrication of my own mind. Even so, this mental fabrication matches the actual blue object. This is what we mean by path luminosity. In his other pith instructions, Mipham Rinpoche mentions that even on the path of unification, one can directly perceive the Dharmadhatu. Now, if we define it as direct perception, since an Arya on the first bhumi truly sees it directly, can the state of the path of unification be considered direct perception as well? Well, a first bhumi bodhisattva sees through the direct perception of dharmata, but on the path of unification, you only see the luminosity aspect through a kind of meditative experience. So there's still a real difference between this meditative experience and direct perception. So what about all these claims of realizing the nature of mind we hear nowadays? In Zen, for example, what kind of level is realizing the nature of mind, really? In my view, it's a state on the path of unification, not yet the first bhumi, not to mention the stage of Buddhahood that is even further away. The same goes for Dzogchen. Many people talk about attaining enlightenment in Dzogchen, but many masters also consider that enlightenment to be on the path of unification. Even my own teacher, His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche, used to say this. When a master gives you Dzogchen instructions and you finally recognize the nature of mind, you've gained an experience through those pith instructions. But this kind of experience is totally different from the usual logical analysis in the middle way. Through the Guru's instructions, you might have an instant enlightenment in that moment. Yet this enlightenment is still quite different from the realization of a first bhumi bodhisattva. Honestly, I've spent a really long time thinking about this. I've thought about it over and over, and my conclusion is it's better to categorize most people's enlightenment as the path of unification. This way, it fits the logic of the teachings much better and avoids any issues. In Zen, they often talk about realizing the nature of mind. Take, for example, when people say a certain master is enlightened. Now, true enlightenment could mean the first bhumi, the second bhumi, or anywhere all the way up to the 10th bhumi. But if they were at that level, those bodhisattvas would surely manifest their enlightened qualities. For instance, a first bhumi bodhisattva has 12 sets of 100 qualities. In a single moment, they can save 100 beings, shake 100 worlds, and so on. And a second bhumi bodhisattva has their own set of qualities. If these qualities don't manifest, then claiming they are on the first or second bhumi, well, Longchenpa says in his other teachings that this is very hard to justify. So, generally speaking, what we call an enlightened master is someone who has fully mastered the analogous wisdom of the path of unification. In fact, even this level is already very advanced. In the Sutrayana, it typically takes one asamkhya kalpa to reach this full wisdom of the path of unification. Anasamkhya kalpa. So if someone achieves this in a single lifetime through a pith instruction, they can certainly be called an enlightened one. But we must remember this is still different from the realization of the first bhumi. I remember my guru, His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche, saying in class once, some people say that enlightenment in Dzogchen should be categorized as the first bhumi, bodhisattva, but defining it this way doesn't make sense. If they were truly first bhumi bodhisattvas, then why don't they have the qualities described in the Ten Bhumi Sutra? Why are those qualities not present? It's true that in the past, certain masters did say that enlightenment in Dzogchen is categorized as the first bhumi. But why did they say that? His Holiness explained that it was to inspire and encourage their disciples. So they labeled it the first bhumi, but in reality it's not really the first bhumi. Those masters had a hidden intention behind their words. Perhaps it was better that way. Of course, some teachers might not even know what a first bhumi really is. They go around saying, oh, you're on the first bhumi, you're on the third. I have so many first bhumi bodhisattvas around me. Well, maybe there's a hidden meaning, or maybe, I remember His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche once very sternly criticized this. He said, people are labeling this person as a first bhumi bodhisattva, and that person as having reached the third or fourth stage of Dzogchen. It's not as simple as that. If they had actually reached that level, they would have absolutely no more mental afflictions. But as it turns out, those people still have afflictions. It's fine to say someone is enlightened, but does being enlightened mean you have no more afflictions? Not necessarily. A person might be enlightened and yet they still carry innate and intellectually acquired afflictions. According to the Sutrayana, at this stage you are only suppressing your afflictions. You haven't fully uprooted them yet. So, most enlightenment we see is mainly on the level of the path of unification. Once you reach this path, if you keep practicing, it becomes very easy to achieve various levels of realization in a very short period of time. I hope you'll take this as a reference. It's a very crucial point. Otherwise, people will keep asking, is there a difference between Zen's seeing the nature of mind and enlightenment in Dzogchen? Is it the same as attaining Buddhahood? But to say it's complete Buddhahood, I wouldn't go that far. A fully enlightened Buddha possesses limitless, inconceivable qualities. Of course, does this kind of instant Buddhahood exist? Yes, we can't rule it out. After all, the phenomenon of attaining Buddhahood in a single lifetime does occur. I've written about these issues in some of my previous articles. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to read them. When illustrative symbolic wisdom initially arises in the mind stream with the first indication of the emergence of the fire-like wisdom of the path of seeing, it is called the heat of the path of unification. Remember, the path of unification has 4 distinct stages. The first one is this sign of heat. Since the wisdom of the first bhumi is like a blazing fire, what comes right before it is a bit of warmth. You start to get a feel for it. This is the heat stage of the path of unification. So what kind of qualities does this stage have? This heat also possesses the prajna that realizes the fundamental nature of the inseparable truth of purity and evenness and the supportive 5 ruling faculties, such as faith. Of course, this realization is still attained through a general image. It's not yet the direct realization of a first Bhumi Bodhisattva. So what exactly is realized? It is a realization of this purity and evenness through subjective experience. It hasn't yet reached that completely unobstructed direct realization. It's accompanied by the 5 faculties: faith, wisdom, diligence, and so on. And these faculties are closely tied to this realization of purity and evenness. In the sutra teachings, these are explained generally as faith, concentration, and diligence. But in Vajrayana, faith means having unwavering faith in this purity and evenness. Diligence means practicing tirelessly to realize this very truth. And concentration means remaining unmoved in the meditation of purity and evenness. Thus, the understanding of these 5 faculties differs from the Sutrayana. These are the qualities of the heat stage. As this increases, even though the 5 ruling faculties, faith and the rest, do not have the potential to become powers in their own right, among virtuous thoughts, they are the utmost. So the realization of the peak of the path of unifications occurs. Of all the contaminated roots of virtue in the mundane world, one has reached the highest summit. That is why it is called the peak stage. At the time of the peak stage, the 5 faculties are unable to overcome their respective non-virtues. However, whenever clear realization of the characteristic of the 5 powers is born in the mind stream, this is called the forbearance of the path of unification. You see, back at the heat and peak stages, your faith still faced many obstacles. Maybe your faith is great today, but after a while, when you run into some difficulties, it immediately starts to fade. Or your wisdom seems fine for a moment. Take some of our Dharma friends or teaching assistants here. They might do well for a while, but after some time, since these are still contaminated virtues, their qualities waver and decline. Once they've lost their way, forget about being teaching assistants. They end up totally lost, just drifting around. It's really sad. So when you look at it, if you compare the wisdom and faith people had 5 years ago to what they have now, you see a massive change. But if everyone here had reached the stage of forbearance, then their faith would be unshakable. Their faith wouldn't waver, and their wisdom couldn't be destroyed by outside circumstances. The same goes for the diligence. When people first arrive at Larungar, they are all so full of energy and diligence. They get up at 4 in the morning, determined to memorize texts. But in the end, they don't even want to think about it anymore. They just want to sleep and try their best to avoid any practice. Their diligence has completely withered away. But once you reach the stage of patience, these obstacles can't destroy you. The 5 faculties transform into the 5 powers. The essence of these powers is the same as the faculties, but they are now firm. This is called the stage of forbearance on the path of unification. In regard to the genuine fundamental nature of phenomena, since the mind is capable of a more elevated experience, it is referred to in this way as the forbearance of the path of unification. You are now very close to the first bhumi. Why is it called an elevated experience? Because you will never lose faith in the meaning of the nature of reality. On the stage of forbearance, first, you will never again fall into the lower realms. Second, you will never feel afraid of the profound meaning of the nature of reality. Your mind is fully capable and steady. That is how it gets its name. When this increases, the ultimate illustrative wisdom that induces actual genuine wisdom is born in the mind stream. This is called supreme dharma. it finally takes root in you. Although for now, it's still the illustrative wisdom. I'll explain the illustrative and ultimate wisdom in a moment. But the ultimate wisdom, which is the realization of a first Bhumi Bodhisattva, can now be triggered instantly. Once this level of illustrative wisdom arises, it is the most sublime state one can reach within the mundane world. This is known as the stage of supreme mundane Dharma. So the fourth and final stage of the path of unification is called supreme Dharma. Given that among worldly paths there are none more supreme, and because this supreme Dharma leads to the path of the Aryas, it is referred to as such. From here, the qualities of the first to the 10th bhumis will gradually be attained. That's why it's called the supreme mundane Dharma. So that covers the path of unification. It's very important to explain these four stages this way. The names given above have been designated according to how the path of unification leads to the path of seeing. Why do we call it the path of unification? What does unification actually mean here? It's because your practice is connecting you with those higher qualities. It leads you toward the path of seeing. By relying on these qualities, you are moving directly toward the realization of a first Bhumi Bodhisattva. That's why it's called unification. That is the reason for the name. Now, regarding the path of unification, there are a few different perspectives. Mifam Rinpoche explains them here. Even the line of demarcation between what is and what is not the path of unification must be apprehended based on the presence or absence of illustrative wisdom in the mind stream. So, what counts as being on the path of preparation? If illustrative wisdom has arisen in your mind, then it's the path of preparation. If that wisdom hasn't arisen, then it's not the path of preparation. Is that the strict line we use to define it? There are those who claim that the practice of the stage of generation occurs on the path of accumulation, and that the practice of the stage of completion, Vajra recitation, and so forth, starts on the path of unification. There are two ways to translate this: Vajra Sattva meditation or Vajra recitation. When I first started translating, I used Vajra recitation. Later, I changed it to Vajra Sattva meditation. But actually, Vajra recitation might be better. Let me think. Yes, that term fits the context better. So let's stick with Vajra recitation. Mifam Rinpoche also discusses this below. This Vajra recitation using Ah Hum is a practice of the completion stage. It involves syncing your breathing with the three syllables, Ah Hum. That's one way people explain this. The generation stage is practiced starting from the path of accumulation, while the completion stage begins at the path of preparation. If so, that would hold true for gradual developers. It really does happen this way for them. They spend the entire path of accumulation practicing the generation stage, and then, upon reaching the path of unification, they take up the completion stage. So for certain gradual practitioners, that is the sequence. However, for instantaneous practitioners, it isn't necessarily like that. They don't always have to do generation stage first and completion stage later. There isn't always a long gap in between for them. Because at the time of empowerment, it is possible for some disciples to achieve simultaneous familiarity and realization by recognizing wisdom. It's like the case of King Indrabhuti we discussed yesterday. The moment he received the empowerment, he attained realization. In such a case of instant realization, you don't need to go through generation and completion stages step by step. Both the generation and completion stages are perfected simultaneously, right there on a single meditation cushion. Furthermore, some may be able to integrate the generation and completion stages right from the start, practicing both stages together right from the start. This could happen on the path of accumulation or on the path of unification. It is also possible to invoke illustrative wisdom through the profound stage of generation, where empty appearances are likened to the moon reflected on water, even on the path of accumulation, by relying on profound generation stage practices, specifically by realizing how all appearances and emptiness are like a moon reflected in water. One can actually bring forth illustrative wisdom, which normally belongs to the path of preparation. Such cases do exist. Nonetheless, despite practicing Vajra recitation and other methods, the possibility still exists that illustrative wisdom will not arise, and consequently the practitioner will still remain on the path of accumulation. There are also cases like this. Some skip the generation stage and go straight to completion stage practices, such as Vajra recitation, and yet they still haven't given rise to illustrative wisdom. In other words, before the illustrative wisdom of the path of unification is gained, one might be practicing the completion stage all along. This means you are practicing the completion stage while still staying on the path of accumulation. This kind of situation is also possible during the path of accumulation. Regardless of which aspects of the generation and completion stages are practiced in accordance with the individual classes of Tantra, ultimately the crucial point is to know that when illustrative wisdom arises in the mind stream, that is called mantra's path of unification. In short, this is the most crucial thing. So these generation and completion stages we've been talking about, sometimes they arise at the same time and sometimes they arise one after the other. Like the Manjushri Great Perfection instructions, it doesn't mention the generation stage first, but directly teaches the completion stage. Now regarding the completion stage, it's quite possible that for those who don't know much about rituals, like many of you here, since we skipped the generation stage this time and went straight to the completion stage, one might actually awaken through these practices and immediately gain the wisdom of the paths of accumulation and unification. It really can happen. So, in short, whenever this true illustrative wisdom arises in your mind stream, that is when you have the authentic realization of the path of unification. Actually, regarding the wisdom of the path of unification, some great masters like Bhutan Rinchen Drub and those in the Yonang tradition have said, our usual mundane wisdom is still just a form of conceptual thought. Whether it's recognizing the nature of your own mind or understanding that all things are equal and pure, there is still a kind of clinging involved. When your clinging is completely free from attachment, an inconceivable state like this, and whether through pith instructions or investigation, you realize that this is just how the nature of all things is, you gain an irreversible wisdom. Knowing the nature of all phenomena is just like this. It is an irreversible wisdom. And that irreversible wisdom is what we call illustrative wisdom. If it were reversible, it would belong to the earlier stages of heat or peak. If its opposing factors, such as wrong views or certain conceptual thoughts, have no power to destroy this wisdom anymore. And when such wisdom arises in your mind stream, we call that the illustrative wisdom of the forbearance stage within the path of unification. Finally, at the stage of supreme mundane dharma, one is on the verge of reaching the first bhumi while still within the mundane world. At that stage, the realization is already very high. But in Vajrayana, for certain practitioners, reaching this level in a single lifetime isn't actually that difficult. If you truly encounter a master's pith instructions and you have the necessary wisdom and faith, when all these conditions come together, just one single instruction can lead you to fully realize that the essence of all phenomena is indeed pure and empty. But this is not understood by relying on conceptual thought. It's an entirely personal experience, a direct feeling. Now, regarding this experience, some great masters still view it as a form of conceptual thought, while others say it can't be conceptual thought. Their reasoning is the wisdom of the first bhumi is non-conceptual. If the path leading to it was still conceptual, there would be a direct contradiction. One simply can't produce non-conceptuality by relying on concepts. So at the end of the path of unification, one must enter into a non-conceptual state. And this entry into non-conceptuality is actually a form of direct perception. Actually, in Buddhist logic, we always say that direct perception has to be non-conceptual. So what the wisdom of the path of unification, is it conceptual or not? Honestly, many masters have differing opinions, but generally speaking, from the perspective of the pith instructions, it should be an entry into non-conceptuality. Why is that? Because when your mind fully realizes that all phenomena are primordially pure and equal, when you're in that non-dual practice, there won't be any contamination from other external distracting thoughts. They aren't the actual practice anyway. So in these aspects, for many of you here in the future, so for all of you here, you can look at this as a theory or as a way to actually practice. Through theory, one can get an idea of what the wisdom of the path of unification is like. That's the logical approach they use in the Sutrayana. But through practice, you finally just get it. No matter how many more words are used, they are pale and powerless. Language just can't get you there. In the end, it is a complete understanding, and it's something you'll never lose. It won't reverse. Perhaps one day in certain environments, in some solitary places, through your master's blessing and your own prayers, you'll catch a glimpse of this for yourself. Now, we can't really call that a full-blown illustrative wisdom just yet. It's more accurate to say that the early signs of that wisdom have started to appear. When you encounter other adverse conditions, your original faith or that glimpse of realization can easily get clouded over again. This kind of situation does happen, but in any case, based on the teachings of the past masters, what we call enlightenment should be defined at the level of illustrative wisdom. In this way, there will be no logical contradiction with the scriptural teachings. Otherwise, if our definition of enlightenment conflicts with these principles, it simply will not hold up, neither in the Sutrayana nor the Vajrayana. One must be able to correctly establish the path. There are also two types of illustrative wisdom. During the first two stages on the path of unification, proximate illustrative wisdom is likened to a drawing of the moon. These principles are explained in detail within the beacon of certainty. This is the painted moon. Take the painted moon as an analogy. During the path of accumulation, one might gain some understanding of the wisdom through listening and contemplation via general images. Then, during the heat and peak stages of the path of unification, your realization is still like that painting of the moon. This is what we call approximate illustrative wisdom, whereas on the latter two stages it is fully qualified and shown to be similar to the actual reflection of the moon on water. Among the types of illustrative wisdom, this one is authentic. The ultimate realization of the path of unification, the indicated genuine wisdom, resembles seeing the actual moon in the sky, seeing the indivisibility of subject-object that is characteristic of the actual moon, invokes the path of seeing. You should be clear on this, right? The first two stages of the path of unification are like a painted moon. Your understanding of the heart of the Dharmadhatu is like a painting of the moon. Generally speaking, it's a circle or a crescent shape. You have a rough idea of what it looks like. Then you reach the moon in water. The moon reflected in water looks much better than a painting. Of course, if I were the one painting it, it would probably look quite bad. The moon in water is superior to the painted moon. This corresponds to the latter two stages of unification. So, when it comes to recognizing the nature of the mind today, I believe most cases of enlightenment fall into this category. It's like seeing the moon in water, but the true moon in the sky hasn't been seen yet. When you see the actual moon in the sky, you are a first Bhumi Bodhisattva. Only at the first Bhumi do you truly see the Dharmadhatu as it is. If you were truly enlightened and saw the Dharmadhatu completely, then all afflictive obscurations would be gone. The qualities of the first Bhumi would have already manifested. But for most people, that level is not so easy to reach. That's why in Zen or Vajrayana, when the great masters talk about attaining Buddhahood in a single lifetime, we have to look at what Buddha really means. In our language, Sangye has two parts. It means you've conquered your afflictions and you've fully expanded your wisdom. In Chandrakirti's own commentary on the Madhyamakavatara, it says, both Sravakas and these middle Buddhas originate from the Buddha. There are many ways to interpret this middle Buddha. Whether in a broad or narrow sense, if we talk about attaining Buddhahood in one life, there are actually two ways to explain what a Buddha is. One way to look at it is the perfect Buddha, and we certainly can't rule that possibility out. But the other way it's used is to describe someone who has gained real insight or reached a certain level of awakening, because Buddha essentially means the awakened one. But there are different levels of awakening. There is the ultimate awakening of a fully enlightened Buddha. Then there's the awakening of a first Bhumi Bodhisattva, which is like seeing the actual moon in the sky. In the latter two stages of unification, it's like seeing the moon's reflection in water, or even earlier on, like seeing a painting of the moon in the first two stages of unification. Even if I haven't seen a painting of the moon yet, if someone describes it to me, the moon looks like this and that. Even if my eyes haven't seen it, my mind starts to form a picture. Ah, the moon is white, round, and incredibly beautiful. Then I think, I get it now. That must be what the moon is like. In the end, when I actually see it, it matches the image I had in my mind perfectly. That kind of awakening is also possible. So, to truly understand the Dharmadhatu, we need profound pith instructions to clarify the truth for everyone. Having that correct understanding is absolutely vital. That definitively knows the truth of the nature of phenomena and becomes realization, possessing the 7 branches of awakening, such as prajna and so forth. A first Bhumi Bodhisattva possesses the clear realization of the 7 branches of awakening. Once you reach the first Bhumi, the views of Sutrayana and Vajrayana are identical. Mipham Rinpoche has also mentioned this in other texts as well. He never said that the path of seeing in Sutrayana is somehow inferior or incomplete, while the Vajrayana path of seeing is superior. He made no such claim. Once you reach the path of seeing, both paths are in total agreement. Sutrayana acknowledges the complete and direct realization of the Dharmadhatu's essence, and Vajrayana says exactly the same thing. So from the first Bhumi onward, there is no difference between the paths of Sutra and Tantra. Before the first Bhumi, it is just as we discussed. During the path of unification or the path of accumulation, the Sutrayana tends to focus one-sidedly on emptiness with insufficient recognition of the luminosity aspect. By comparison, the Vajrayana has a much more superior approach in this regard. So why is the Vajrayana faster? Its real speed comes from certain differences during the paths of accumulation and unification, before you reach the path of seeing. Because once you've reached the path of seeing, some Prajnaparamita sutras even say that if one wishes to attain Buddhahood, it can be achieved in just 7 days. So, regarding the speed after the path of seeing, there isn't much difference between Sutra and Tantra. That makes perfect sense. Now, regarding the wisdom of the path of seeing, for instance, it mentions the 7 branches of awakening and so on. Are there any differences in depth or breadth between the 7 branches of awakening and the 8-branch path of the Aryas in Sutra versus Tantra? It should be said there are none. There is likely no difference in this regard. Everyone should keep this point in mind. It is then that mantra's path of meditation arises in the stream of mind, characteristic of the 8-branch path of the Aryas, such as the perfectly correct view of actually seeing phenomenal existence as great purity and evenness. Given that there are 9 stages on the ground of the path of meditation, there are also 9 obstructions. When the wisdom of the path of learning that serves as the antidote to the greatest of the great obstructions to be abandoned on the path of meditation arises in the mind stream, one reaches the 2nd ground on the path of meditation. Since the first Bhumi is already the path of seeing, everything from the 2nd to the 10th Bhumi is collectively known as the 9 stages of the path of meditation. These 9 levels are further divided into 3, upper, middle, and lower. Each of those is subdivided: upper, 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 middle, lower, middle, middle, lower, lower, upper, lower, middle, and lower, lower. When divided into these 9 levels, the first wisdom of a learner that serves as the antidote to the upper level of obscurations. Once it arises in the mind stream, one begins the 2nd Bhumi. Finally, once the lower level of obscurations is eliminated, it is the end of the 10th Bhumi. The path is generally categorized this way from the 2nd to the 10th Bhumis. The other stages are gradually achieved in the same way. Finally, by means of the antidote to the smallest of the small obstructions being abandoned on the path of meditation, one arrives at the stage of the ultimate wisdom of the path of learning, and the final stage of the 10th ground is achieved. By virtue of the Vajra-like samadhi of evenness with the ultimate fundamental nature, even the subtle seeds of the 2 obstructions will be completely uprooted. At the very end of the 10th Bhumi, there is a specific Vajra-like samadhi. Vajra-like samadhi is the antidote that destroys even the most subtle cognitive obscurations. Through the meditative absorption of this Vajra-like samadhi, and by its power, one will become fully awakened as the supreme result of the path of perfect liberation, the extremely pristine wisdom kaya of non-dual, no further learning. This occurs at the end of the 10th Bhumi. At that moment, the true fruit of perfect enlightenment is manifested. Moreover, it should be understood that the names of the grounds conform to the vehicle of the paramitas. For example, in Sutrayana, the first Bhumi is called the joyous. The second is the stainless. It is the same in Vajrayana. In his great commentary on the Guhyagarbha Tantra, Longchenpa explains how these stages correspond perfectly. From the first to the 10th bhumi, the names and the qualities are exactly the same. And the qualities and signs of development are also in harmony with whatever is taught in the scriptures of Sutra and Mantra. Regarding the differences between Sutrayana and Vajrayana, I believe that once we finish studying the Guhyagarbha Tantra, all their specific characteristics, their commonalities, and their unique points will become clear to you, whether it's from sutras like the Tenbhumi Sutra, or treatises such as the 5 treatises of Maitreya and the Madhyamakavatara. The principles of the 5 paths and 10 bhumis are extensively explained. You can find and study these teachings in many other sacred texts as well. In this way, the presentation of the 5 paths is based on how the genuine clear light of the fundamental nature of phenomena is recognized. In this context, the 5 paths, including the path of seeing and so on, are established based on the principle of the luminosity of the meaning of the direct perception of the Dharmata. So, how exactly are they established? The next part explains. On the path of accumulation, clear light is merely theoretical in the context of hearing and contemplation. At the path of accumulation, our realization is known as the luminosity of literal understanding. For many of us, this is exactly where we stand with luminosity. Through study and reflection, we've come to understand Tathagatagarbha. We've come to understand that the nature of all things is pure and equal. Now we have a very firm and clear understanding of this. This state is known as the luminosity of understanding on the path of accumulation. On the path of unification, clear light is illustrative. Illustrative luminosity is an actual experience. It's not just something you've heard from others, you have felt it for yourself. However, this experience is still not the same as the direct realization of a first bhumi bodhisattva. As we mentioned, it's like seeing a painting of the moon or a reflection in water. This is how the illustrative luminosity feels. Mipham Rinpoche explains this very well here. He uses these metaphors of the painted moon and water moon to show exactly how this stage of luminosity is perceived. On the path of seeing it is genuine. At that stage, you have seen it completely, like seeing the actual moon in the sky. On the path of meditation, it is based on learning. Since the path of meditation consists of 9 levels, there is real progressive advancement. This is called the luminosity of a learner. And on the path of no further learning, clear light is fully perfected. Finally, the original nature of the inconceivable Dharmadhatu fully manifests. This ultimate luminosity only manifests at the stage of Buddhahood. On the grounds of the Aryas, there is no difference in terms of the actual realization of the basic. As we've discussed, from the perspective of the emptiness of the Dharmadhatu, there is no difference between a first bhumi and a 10th bhumi bodhisattva. However, there are significant differences in the way ever-increasing lucid appearances are achieved. Of course, that realm is purely the domain of the Noble One's individual self-cognition. It's like the tracks of a bird flying through the sky. You just can't pinpoint or trace them. It is very difficult for us to measure the luminosity of a first bhumi versus that of a second bhumi bodhisattva. When we use our conceptual minds to analyze these states, we often end up arguing during our studies. We tend to challenge each other with logical objections. For instance, someone might ask, is the luminosity seen by a first bhumi bodhisattva exactly the same as what's seen at the end of the 10th bhumi? If it's the same, then a first bhumi bodhisattva would already be a 10th bhumi bodhisattva. But if you say it's different, then you're saying the first bhumi bodhisattva hasn't yet seen the true nature of reality. You can go back and forth with these debates forever. However, when ordinary people use their limited minds for such debates, it's just like a group of blind men touching an elephant. Each person touches a different part and claims the elephant is shaped like this or that. Some say it is oval-shaped, others say it is something else entirely. It's exactly like that. The commentary on the 400 stanzas describes many such people. Some touch the elephant's tail and say an elephant is like a staff or a club. Another touches the ear and thinks the elephant is just a flat sheet. Someone else touches the belly, and they all come up with their own claims. So when ordinary people try to describe the realization of the first or second bhumi, they are just like those blind men. Everyone has their own version, but just like the tracks of a bird in the sky, these realms are beyond our limited measures. We cannot conceptually grasp these states through dualistic study and reflection. For this reason, distinctions of the 10 grounds are determined dependent upon how lucid appearances are achieved from the time certainty arises in post-evanescence, while the qualities of abandonment and realization become increasingly more sublime. From the first bhumi to the 10th bhumi, there is actually no difference in terms of seeing the Dharmadhatu directly or attaining the clarity of appearance. It's like looking at the moon. I remember about 20 years ago, I was reading many commentaries on the Madhyamakavatara, including some Indian ones. I found one explanation that I really connected with. Back then, I was living in a very shabby little wooden hut. I felt it was very accurate. The commentary said, when we look at the moon from here, we do indeed see it. But as you get closer and closer to it, the moon becomes much clearer, more vivid, and feels more immediate. So, a first Bhumi Bodhisattva is like someone seeing the moon from a great distance. You've seen the real thing, but as you draw nearer, right up until you are close to it, your understanding becomes complete. From the first to the 10th bhumis, there is no difference in terms of what is actually seen. The first time was a genuine seeing as well, but as you get closer, it becomes increasingly vivid. Therefore, for these bodhisattvas from the first to the 10th bhumis, the certainties gained in subsequent attainment and the obstacles they abandon are gradual. Afflictive and cognitive obscurations are progressively eliminated and their qualities of realization become ever more sublime. This is how the distinctions among the 10 bhumis can be determined. All right, let's stop here for today.
Jirgana jirano chupai Chupun solen droa droa sho
Bandharangara Badma Sodargye Bandharangara Badma Sodargye Bandharangara Badma Sodargye